as I was saying, Charles VII, who is in fact sometimes called the well-advised, appointed men to high office, so it's often argued anyway, on the basis more of their ability than because of their noble rank. This was among the factors which made him some enemies among the nobility, understandably, but it's one of the things about him historians, one of the few things, I might say, about him historians have generally applauded. This is Jean Fouquet's pencil portrait of Guillaume Juvenal des Ursins, whom Charles appointed to be his chancellor. We have another opportunity here to compare what was apparently a preliminary study with a finished portrait of the subject, which you can see now. This is the painting of Guillaume Juvenal des Ursins, which you see here in the Louvre today. Again, I think one could argue that the sketch is more lifelike. Juvenal des Ursins was a soldier and lawyer and was the chief prosecutor in the case of the Duc d'Alençon, who, as we heard before the break, was one of the chief opponents of the king's policies and paid for his rebellion with his life. In French, incidentally, ours means bear, and you see bears used as supporters for his coat of arms there. The king's most famous counselor was Jacques Coeur, who was born in this house, or at least near this spot, into a prosperous merchant's family in Bourges. Maybe I should say that's not to be confused with Bruges. Bourges, B-O-U-R-G-E-S, is south of Paris in central France. Bruges, of course, B-R-U-G-E-S, where Van Eyck worked, is in Flanders. The king probably came into contact with the Coeurs in the 1420s when he was down and out and could barely afford to put food on his own table. And by the time he had reoccupied Paris, his respect for Jacques Coeur's financial acumen had grown to the point that he appointed him argentier, or treasurer, and in 1441 he ennobled him. This is the Palais Jacques Coeur in Bourges now. Jacques was also used as a diplomat because of the connections he'd established through his multinational corporations. He served Charles as ambassador to the Pope, Nicholas V, and the latter even granted him permission to cheat infidels on business deals, although he didn't become a billionaire without cheating a few Christians as well, I imagine. In 1443, the same year that Chancellor Rollin began the Hôtel Dieu in Beaune, Jacques began building the Palais Jacques Coeur, as it's called today, in Bourges, and these two buildings are generally considered the finest surviving 15th century urban buildings in France, secular urban buildings, I should say. The back of the palace, which is what you see here, was built into the old wall of the Roman city, and some parts of it can still be seen at the lower levels. Jacques was the richest man in the country by the time this was underway and had more ships than the French Navy. Here you see the street facade. Jacques loaned money to everybody, to the Pope, to the King, to the Doge of Venice, to the Knights of Rhodes. But loaning people money doesn't always make them your friends, as he was to find out. This is another outstanding example, this building, of the secular Gothic, you see, surviving in effect into the Renaissance. And it's interesting to compare it with what was going on in Florence at this time. This is the Palazzo Rucellai in Florence. We don't know the name of the architect of Jacques Coeur's palace, or the name of the architect of the Hôtel Dieu we saw earlier for that matter, but this is the great Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti's work. And one glance can tell you which building style is going to influence the future and which was essentially old-fashioned even at the time it was built. This would hardly look out of place on Wall Street or Main Street today. In France and Northern Europe generally, the Italian Renaissance style doesn't really catch on until after 1500. Here's the courtyard of the Palais Jacques Coeur now, back in Bourges. Certainly no one would mistake this for a modern building. We're going to hear another song by Guillaume Dufay now while we see a little bit more of this building. Appropriately enough, I think this song is called J'ai mis mon cœur, I've given my heart, although I don't believe that Dufay had Jacques Coeur in mind when he wrote this song. Before we begin here, too, you might just take a glance at Jacques Coeur's well-known motto. This is in the chapel of the Palais Jacques Coeur. A vaillant cœur, rien impossible. To a valiant heart, nothing is impossible. It almost looks like a bumper sticker with its hearts here. This song by Dufay is one of the most popular of the 15th century. It was used by other composers in various instrumental settings. You may recognize it from the introduction to this lecture, number 5. In the 15th century, no songwriter, no composer stipulated what instruments were to be used in the performance of his music. And there is a lot of controversy about things like tempo and rhythm still. But the tune obviously is basically the same. If you can think back to that introduction, you'll recognize this tune. This is a version with the original lyrics now. This is the so-called Merchants Gallery inside the palace now. And the so-called Festival Gallery. By the side of the fireplace in the festival room, there's this charming little sculpture, a man with his dog, a sort of generic dog that looks a lot like my dog. I suppose that's partly why I took this picture here. Jacques Coeur's motto might have offended some. Nothing is impossible. A vaillant cœur, rien impossible, for this nouveau riche merchant. It reminds me a little bit, this motto, of Nicolas Fouquet, whom we'll hear about in a few months as Louis XIV's ill-fated treasurer, and who had a similar motto, to what heights may I not climb? As I mentioned, Jacques Coeur loaned money to everybody, but that didn't make him a lot of friends. As Gore Vidal says, no good deed ever goes unpunished. Few of us would be inclined, I imagine, to do favors for Bank of America or Wells Fargo just because they've loaned us money. You're seeing the ship window, as it's called, in the festival room again at the Palais Jacques Coeur. Here's the sacristy in the Cathedral of Bourges now. Jacques donated money to the cathedral for the construction of a new sacristy. In 1450, things began to change for Jacques. The king's mistress, Agnès Sorel, died, and a woman to whom Jacques had loaned a lot of money claimed he poisoned her. The motive for this accusation seems obvious. One doesn't have to repay a debt to an executed criminal. Considering that she had no real evidence and that Jacques was regarded as a friend of the king, her accusation seems a little reckless, but she got plenty of support from others who also owed him a lot, finally including the king himself. Jacques was also accused of various white-collar crimes and imprisoned. This is the Annunciation window, which was commissioned as part of the decor of the chapel of Saint-Ursin, which Jacques also paid for in the Cathedral of Bourges. By the 15th century, the great age of stained glass was long over, but this is usually considered the finest window of that century in France. After 3 years in prison, some of his friends arranged Jacques' escape and he fled to Rome, where Pope Calixtus III put him in charge of a fleet to be sent against the Turks. Jacques thought this would give him a chance to recoup some of his losses, but he died in the Aegean while on this campaign in 1456. This is the modern statue of him in front of the Palais Jacques-Coeur in Bourges. So King Charles VII betrayed the two people who were probably most valuable to him, Joan of Arc and Jacques Coeur. One supplied him with the spiritual help to defeat the English, the other with the material help. If he'd played his cards right, with heroes like these on his side, Charles could have made himself a reputation that would have put him among France's greatest kings. But instead, he is, as we've heard, regarded rightly, I think, as a weak, vacillating, and untrustworthy fellow, despite the fact that, as I've said, he's one of the great survivors in royal history. This is the tomb of Agnès Sorel at Loches. She's the first woman to hold the position of mistress en titre, or official, at least semi-official, and publicly acknowledged mistress of a king of France. Later, such influential women as Diane de Poitiers, Madame de Maintenon, Madame de Pompadour, and Madame du Barry will occupy this office and become thereby among the most influential women in French history. The theory was that although the king usually had to marry for political reasons, this should not deprive him of the company of a woman whom he really loved. There was, however, no corresponding official lover for the queen. Agnès, like many of her successors, was the focus of considerable jealousy and resentment and had many enemies who weren't sorry about her early death. And Jacques Coeur wasn't the only one accused of poisoning her. The king's own son, a more likely, if still unlikely, candidate, was accused of the crime by his enemies too. Although she was certainly born no earlier than about 1422, later legend had her playing a major role in the career of Joan of Arc, helping, for example, to persuade Charles of her value. This is the role she plays in Schiller's fanciful play about Joan, which is even less well-founded historically than Shaw's St. Joan. This is the Antwerp panel now of the famous Mélan diptych by Jean Fouquet. We're hearing Dufay's song, Pour l'amour de ma douce amie, for the love of my sweet friend. This might seem a little inconsistent with my showing you an altarpiece, but I think it can be justified considering the circumstances surrounding its creation, or at least the legend thereof. The Virgin is generally thought to be a de facto portrait of Agnès. The altarpiece was commissioned by Etienne Chevalier, another of Charles's non-noble advisors. Legend has it that Etienne had a crush on Agnès, and so ordered Fouquet to represent her as the Virgin in this way. By the time this was painted, he had served with Richemont as ambassador to England. The character of the portrait might lead you to wonder about its reception, but the fact that the Virgin is provocatively topless may, I think, have aroused less comment than her very comme il faut fashion treatment with the plucked scalp and eyebrows. This is the other half now of the diptych, this half now in Berlin. And we see Etienne Chevalier himself now, he's the smaller fellow, with his patron saint Stephen holding the rocks with which he was stoned to death in the book of Acts. There are E's linked by what are called love knots on the frame, and Jan Huizinga, among others, believes the story of Etienne's crush on the king's mistress to be true. The picture was painted after her death, but it still could, I suppose, be viewed as a memorial to his love. If he did have a crush on Agnès Sorel, he must have been doubly satisfied by the fall of Jacques Coeur. It meant that the man he may well have thought responsible for the death of his beloved was doomed, and then Chevalier himself was to become his successor as treasurer of France. Etienne Chevalier was certainly among Fouquet's most important clients, and it may be that Fouquet did more surviving work for him than for any other patron, including the king. In the 1450s, Fouquet made a fine hours book for Etienne Chevalier, which included some 60 full-page paintings, most of which are now on display at the Château de Chantilly north of Paris. In this picture, we see Job suffering on his dunghill in what seems to be the Bois de Vincennes east of Paris. This is the chateau we've already seen used as background in the work by Paul de Limburg in the Tres Richeurs manuscript, and of which we've also seen a modern photograph of the Chateau de Vincennes showing that it's changed little in nearly 700 years. As the tallest secular building of its day in the neighborhood of Paris, it obviously stood out as a major monument. Here you can see the Adoration of the Magi, and the front magus there is apparently Charles VII. This book has been taken apart and its pages mounted on the walls of the chapel at Chantilly, which allows us to see them nicely. But of course this means that the book itself no longer exists. That's too bad, but there's no other way for ordinary tourists to see all the pictures. Purists, contemptuous of ordinary tourists, motivated to look at the pages only by mild curiosity anyway, don't like this. But I think it's a policy that can be defended. The best argument on the side of the purists, I think, is that facsimiles can be printed, as has been done, of course, in the case of most of the famous illuminated manuscripts like the Tres Richeurs that should satisfy even demanding curiosity, while allowing original manuscripts to maintain their integrity. And here's Etienne Chevalier himself at prayer with, again, his patron saint, Stephen. This is another interesting manuscript illustration now from a different book, the Chronique du Hainaut by the 15th century historian Simon Knockert. The illustration on this page is thought to have been painted by the great Roger van der Weyden, about whom we'll hear a lot more in a few minutes. In the picture you may recognize Philip the Good again, as we return to Burgundian affairs now. Remember, he was described as thin but not excessively so? I think this might border on the excessive. He looks anorexic, kind of like a big insect. The fellow kneeling in front of him is Simon Knockert, the author of the book. When Gibbon presented The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to George III, the king is supposed to have frowned and said, "Well, another damn thick book, eh, Mr. Gibbon?" And it looks like that thought might have crossed the Duke of Burgundy's mind here. You can recognize Chancellor Rollin probably at the left. He's standing with Jean Chevreul, whom you'll probably remember as the fellow who had to tell Philip of Rollin's death. The boy in the center is Philip's legitimate son, who will be known as Charles the Bold. Behind him is thought to be Philip's famous illegitimate son Anthony, known as the Grand Bâtard de Bourgogne, the great bastard of Burgundy, but there's a certain family resemblance among all those fellows at the back which suggests that there may have been more than one great bastard of Burgundy. The fellow at the right is apparently Philippe de Croy, who became Philip's chamberlain. And who is thought to be the subject of this portrait by van der Weyden, although the two men look nothing alike. Philippe de Croy was involved in one of the many conflicts between Philip and his son, Charles, when the Duke wanted Philippe de Croy as his chamberlain, and Charles wanted him to appoint Rollin's son Antoine. One would suppose that Philip would put the son of his chancellor in any post he wanted, but the problem was that The office was supposed to be hereditary, and Philippe de Croix's father had held it. Philip finally had his way at the cost of much trouble with his bold, or better, his reckless son. Here's an anonymous sketch of father and son. The French word téméraire is usually translated bold, but reckless is perhaps a better translation. In any case, the word gives you a better idea of Charles's character. During the last 10 years or so of Philip's life, Charles acquired more and more influence until at his father's death he was already essentially acting Duke of Burgundy. He spent much time in Bruges, but was never in one place and roamed from town to town, as the song goes. He spent quite a bit of time in Brussels, for example, which is no longer as charming as Bruges as a result of its greater commercial success over the last few centuries. While there is vacant land in several places in Bruges between the town and the city walls still, in Brussels one has to look hard to find any traces of the ancient city at all beyond the Grand Place. The Hall Gate, which you see here on the south side of the city, is the biggest surviving part of the 14th century wall, begun by Philip the Good's distant ancestor, distant relative I should say really, the Emperor Wenceslas the Drunken. Today, if you say you're going to Brussels, people assume it's on business. Herb Caen referred to it as the Kansas City of Europe, by which he did not mean to flatter either city. Some interesting relics do survive, however, and it has a fine, usually nearly empty, Musée des Beaux-Arts. Also, it was the main residence of Roger van der Weyden and then of Peter Bruegel, and the part-time residence of Rubens, Jacques-Louis David, Vincent van Gogh, and others, and not many cities can claim that many great artists as even part-time citizens. Brussels was technically part of Brabant rather than Flanders at this time, but this was all part of the domain of the Duke Philip and his son Charles. This is the royal palace as it looks today on the Coudenberg Hill. Charles wouldn't recognize any of this, but it's where the old palace, which he would recognize, used to be 600 years ago. It's on the hill above the center of the old city, the Grand Place, down across the Rue Royale. Here you can see the Grand Place in Brussels from the air now, down the hill from the Royal Palace. This is the most historically important part of Brussels surviving. The Grand Place here is one of the great public squares in Europe. The Hotel de Ville was begun in Philip the Good's day about 1420. In about 1700, the French wrecked this part of the city, and the Hotel de Ville, although it was badly damaged, is the only 15th century building still standing on the square. The tower is 364 feet high, which makes it the highest on a secular building in Europe before the 20th century, I think. Roger van der Weyden's Justice pictures, considered his greatest works by his contemporaries, were here until the destruction of 1700. While we see a little more of the Grand Place and also the Cathedral of St. Michael's in Brussels, we're going to hear a hymn, Alma Redemptoris Mater, Hail the Mother of the Redeemer, by Johannes Akegum. We'll hear quite a bit more about him next week, one of the great 15th century, one of the great Renaissance Flemish composers. The Hotel de Ville from ground level now. Across the square is the so-called King's House, which was rebuilt in the 19th century, but in the original Renaissance style. This is the Cathedral of Brussels, the Cathedral of St. Michael's up the hill Considered perhaps the finest Gothic church in the Low Countries, although it's rarely seen in histories of art, its interior now, Roger van der Weyden was buried here, as was Anthony, Charles the Bold's half-brother. Charles himself was married here to one of his 4 wives. The first great painter in the history of Brussels is Roger van der Weyden, by whom we've already seen a manuscript painting just a couple of minutes ago, and then we saw his portrait of Philip the Good last time. About 30 years ago, when Thomas Hoving was serving as curator of the cloisters and had not yet become the buffoon who wrote Art for Dummies, he lamented that the people in charge of the purse strings at the cloisters wouldn't buy this picture attributed to Roger when it came up for sale because it was thought too small, and it was thought it would be unimpressive to the museum visiting public. It went instead to the Washington National Gallery. It's now the smallest panel picture that museum owns, in fact, and it's smaller than many manuscript illuminations, about 4 inches high. Its date is unknown, but it is probably among his earliest surviving works. We know Roger van der Weyden was a pupil of Robert Campin, Tournai, and didn't set up shop on his own until he was well into his 20s, so it may have been done while he was technically still a student. The picture is dominated by the figure of the knight St. George killing his dragon, but the most memorable part of it is the wonderful coastal city in the background, which is among the best, almost fairy tale-like urban scenes so common in 15th century Flemish art. In 1435, Roger was appointed city painter in Brussels and painted the Justice pictures I mentioned earlier for the Hôtel de Ville. These pictures, which were destroyed by the French in 1700, were regarded as his best work by his contemporaries. But in his surviving corpus, the Prado de Cent, which you see here now, is generally considered his masterpiece. As the picture we just saw is one of the smallest panel paintings of the 15th century in Flanders, this is one of the largest. At 7 feet by 10 feet, it's more or less 1,000 times the size of the little postcard St. George. It is also far larger than any single panel by Van Eyck or Robert Campin. It was painted for the Crossbowmen's Guild of Louvain, now a suburb of Brussels, and taken to Spain for Philip II in the 16th century. We're lucky to have it at all. The ship carrying it apparently sank and had floated ashore in a wooden case. In some ways, it's old-fashioned. Globally, it's very much a symbol rather than an accurate depiction of what the setting of the subject might have been like. The crucifixion didn't take place in a gold box, for example. Locally, however, it's very realistic, although not quite so meticulously detailed as Van Eyck's work. Those who prefer Roger to Van Eyck like to argue that the lack of what they are pleased to call distracting details here, there are no tiny little cities with tinier buildings and still tinier people, makes the overall impact more powerful. I think the impact it makes, however, is primarily due to its monumental size. The figures are as big as life, and tourists who wander downstairs in the Prado, and most tour groups don't, are stunned to suddenly encounter it. I've seen almost all the famous and not so famous paintings in almost all the famous and not so famous galleries in Europe, and no painting ever impressed me more at first sight than this one. It is also often pointed out that there's a kind of rhythmic unity to the composition that's foreign to Van Eyck's work usually. The pose of Mary echoes that of Jesus, and the figures of John on the left and Mary Magdalene on the right also echo one another and form a set of sort of human parentheses enclosing the scene. Likewise, the pose of the figure which is perhaps supposed to represent Mary of Cleopas is a reflection of the pose of the figure which is probably supposed to represent Joseph of Arimathea. Here's the left-hand side up more closely. There's also much more emotional display in this work than is typical in Van Eyck's work, although it's true he didn't paint this subject. And the crucifixion attributed to him in the New York Metropolitan Museum, which we did not see, is emotional at least to the extent required by the subject, I think. Again, it's the size really here of Roget's picture as much as anything that makes the emotion seem so much more intense, even if it's represented in a kind of stylized way. At the right here are Mary Magdalene and probably Joseph of Arimathea up closer now. The Seven Sacraments altarpiece, now in the Antwerp Musée des Beaux-Arts, was painted by Roger van der Weyden for Philip the Good's friend Jean Chevreul, the Bishop of Tournai, whom we saw earlier in the manuscript illustration by Roger. The triptych arrangement is typical for altarpieces, of course, but Roger has combined the three pictures in effect into one in a way that became popular in the 15th century. The Sacrament of the Mass is represented in the center panel in a way that is again globally symbolic and locally realistic. As the priest raises the hostie, Christ crucified appears in the church. Representations of the other six sacraments are arranged around the scene, from left, back, and around to the right: baptism, confirmation, confession, ordination, marriage, and extreme unction. Here's the central panel up more closely now. The church interior is similar to that of St. Michael's in Brussels, which we saw earlier, and this shouldn't surprise anyone considering that Roger lived in Brussels most of his adult life and was buried in the church. The altarpiece was probably actually painted after the trip that Roger made to Rome in 1450. This was a Jubilee year during which a plenary indulgence could be had for making a pilgrimage to the city. And since we know that Roger's daughter had just died, it may be that his real purpose was to obtain an indulgence on her behalf. In any case, he stayed in Italy for some time, undertook several important commissions, and was widely feted and praised. This portrait of Francesco d'Este, the uncle of Alfonso, Isabella, and Beatrice d'Este, about whom we heard last quarter, was probably painted during the trip, though some think it was painted later when Francesco was in Brussels. It's now in the New York Metropolitan Museum. In any case, Roger did apparently paint this picture for the Estes during his Italian sojourn, though it eventually came into the possession of the Medici and is now in the Uffizi Gallery. It's interesting to compare this with the Prado Descent, which we saw earlier, because although the subjects are very similar, the treatments are very different. This picture, though painted in Italy for Italians, is much more Flemish than the Prado equivalent, the Prado Descent, which was painted in Brussels. We know the Italians like Flemish pictures in general, however, and it may be that Roget was asked to do this in the typical Flemish manner with lots of virtuoso details, flowers, brocades, cityscapes. Here's the background up more closely. Details like these we see in Flemish pictures make it seem like the 15th century must have been a great time in which to live, but of course insects and rodents don't usually show up in these pictures, nor do the bad food and bad smells and so on. These details, like the one you see here, remind me a little bit of modern real estate brochures touting home developments in places like San Bernardino. You know, they can look pretty good on their best days, but would you really want to spend your life there? Another interesting picture is this one done for the Medici and now in Frankfurt. This also painted on Roget's Italian trip in the early 1450s. He may have arrived there actually late in 1449. Here are the Medici saints, Cosmas and Damian, the doctors, i.e. Medici, who practiced medicine for nothing, which has made some question whether these saints ever really existed at all, I think. Peter and John are the namesakes of Cosimo de' Medici's sons, Piero and Giovanni, and they appear in the picture you see here. The red lily of Florence is obvious at the bottom, and the all-blue dress of the Virgin is in the Italian fashion. Roger van der Weyden didn't spend much time in Bruges, apparently, but after his return from Italy, he painted an altarpiece for Pierre Bladelin, the treasurer of Philip the Good's Order of the Golden Fleece, who lived where the Palais Bladelin still stands in Bruges. It was Bladelin who took the ransom which Philip paid to have Charles d'Orléans released from his 25-year-long house arrest in England after he was captured at Agincourt. You'll perhaps remember that Charles d'Orléans was the half-brother of Jean Dunois, and we'll hear more about him later in the quarter as the father of Louis XII and as one of the more important French poets of the 15th century. After his ransom was paid, he married Philip's niece. Here's the Bladelin altarpiece today as it looks in Berlin, painted for Philip's treasurer Pierre Bladelin. At the right are clearly the three magi in the manner which was to become usual as of three ages and three racial types, or at least three skin colors. Mantegna, about 10 years later maybe, usually gets credit in Italy for painting the first black magus, but one of these is at least dark-skinned. At the left, the Emperor Augustus, dressed as a Renaissance prince, is receiving, according to medieval tradition, his version of the Annunciation from the Sibyl. As we've heard in earlier quarters, this tradition led to the regarding of the Sibyls as something like the pagan equivalent to the Old Testament prophets, and went a long way toward making it possible to treat some Latin classics, and especially the works of Virgil, who was also thought to have been privy to the good news, as at least useful, even if they weren't part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the center, it seems obvious that we have Pierre Bladelin himself adoring the baby Jesus, and it's been suggested that the city in the background is Middelburg, of which Bladelin is considered something like the founding father. Bladelin was a formidable fellow at the court of Philip the Good, although he looks rather milquetoasty in this image. Here he is up closer. And in the background is Middelburg, the city he is said to have in some sense founded, although we know it was in existence back in the Middle Ages. Every brick and every building is an individual little work of art here. Okay, that's where we'll end this lecture. Next time we'll finish van der Weyden's career with the Bone and St. Columba altarpieces, among other things. We'll hear more about Flemish painters like Dirk Bouts and Hans Memling, and about the adventures of Charles the Bold and Louis XI, the Spider King. And I'm going to sing a song. You won't want to miss that.